Okay, so welcome everyone to the New Zionist Congress. My name is Yuval, and today we're going to be hosting a talk back with the creators of the documentary, The Conspiracy Libel, which we hope many of you have taken the time to watch. This film documents a particular accusation made against the Jewish people spanning from the French Revolution to the Holocaust. For centuries, our people have been accused of being sinister puppet masters, controlling societies and politics, rigging the banks and the media for our own interest, and of course, starting wars and revolutions. The Conspiracy Libel seeks to shed light on how this form of anti-Semitism was born and how it spread, and it does so with an impressive amount of research. The Conspiracy Libel was written, produced, directed, and researched by Noah Manor and Joseph Duenas, who are right here with us today. And I want to give you some background on these two incredible individuals who happen to be my sister and my brother-in-law. So Joseph Duenas was born in New Jersey and moved to Florida in 2005. In 2010, he graduated Full Sail University, where he studied film. In 2017, Joe wrote, produced, and directed a feature film titled Guff Punch, which explored the world of stand-up comedy. And he has also published articles at several publications, including Jewish Journal, American Spectator, Arutz Sheva, and Times of Israel. Noah Manor was born in Tel Aviv, Israel, and moved to the States with her family in 2002. Apart from being an entrepreneur, Noam is active in the South Florida stand-up comedy scene, and she's performed her set in venues across the country. She co-produced Guff Punch with Joe, and in July of 2019, she and Joe received a certificate of special congressional recognition from Congressman Stephen Horsford for their participation in the Heart Women's Summit. She's also active on social media with respect to a wide range of issues affecting the Jewish community. So that was a mouthful. Before we get started, I just want to say thank you all for joining this evening, and to keep updated on more events like this, make sure to sign up to become an official member of the New Zionist Congress at newzionist.org. That's newzionist.org. And please follow us on Twitter at New Zionists and on Instagram at New Zionist Congress. So I will start off my first question by going all the way back to the beginning. You're a married couple and you're both Jewish, but you have slightly different interests and backgrounds, and neither of you is being paid for this kind of work. So what is it that inspired you to undertake the effort of making this film?
You want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Well, first, let us thank New Zionist Congress for allowing us to come and discuss the movie. It's truly an honor. Thank you, Yuval and Isaac. Thank you all for joining us. The inspiration was actually, I started getting interested in what I was seeing when Jeremy Corbyn was rising up in UK politics. And even a little bit before that, on YouTube, a few years back, there was a lot of people have probably seen this, but there was a lot of RT, there was Press TV, there was a lot of like state-sponsored news programs on YouTube. It wasn't labeled that way at the time, but you noticed that they were like dabbling in conspiracy theories about Israel that were very unnerving, and they sounded reminiscent of something else. And so I got interested in what that is. And we started going down this path of investigating conspiracy theory and how it relates to anti-Semitism. And when we started digging into that subject, we discovered a sort of history that this was not something that was sporadic, that it was not something that was unique. It was that there's been a consistent presence of anti-Semitism in Western politics for centuries, and there was a real historical story there. And so we wanted to tell that and get into that, to kind of reveal what is behind this. I mean, the inspiration was to explain, or let's begin to shed light on anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, the Judeo-Masonic conspiracy theory, the international Jewish conspiracy, Zog, whatever you want to call it. What underlies that, and why does it exist? So we initially were going to do one movie that put like contemporary anti-Zionism and anti-Zionist conspiracy theories into a historical context with secular anti-Semitism from the 19th century, but that would be like, you know, a 5-hour-long movie. So we decided to split it, and we put out the first one, and we're working on the second one.
Yeah.
So what do you think?
So I think my response would be probably a little bit more emotional. mine and Yuval's grandparents are Holocaust survivors, and it's always been stories in our childhood about how the world either turned against us or turned a blind eye to what was happening. And as the years progressed, and I saw that it's not just a boogeyman that happened, like a story that happened and is no longer a real thing. Anti-Semitism was becoming, it was rising in a very, very scary way, especially for Jewish people in America. And with Joe's skills, with his movie making skills, it became a very realistic idea for us to create something that would maybe put it in a very simple, the simplest way possible to create this historical timeline that will show the parallels between what happened then and what is happening now.
And Noam took me to Israel, I think, just months before we started writing it. And going to Israel is a very moving experience. It's kind of surreal for someone in the West to go to Israel, because Israel's demonized so much in the West, in today's world, that you go there and it really shows you the level of delusion that we're dealing with when you see some of the rhetoric surrounding Israel. And so that was very inspiring as well. It was my first trip there.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's where it all started. And then here we are.
So I think a follow-up question is, in the past several years, we've seen that in society it's become less acceptable to be prejudiced, to be hateful towards different minority groups. But yet you still felt the need to make a documentary to help people understand and recognize anti-Semitism. So my question is, what is it about the nature of anti-Semitism, this conspiracy, as the title alludes to, that makes it so difficult for people who are otherwise social justice minded to recognize, to the point where it can come from someone like Jeremy Corbyn, who claims to call himself an anti-racist?
Well, anti-Semitism, as we all know, it comes in different forms, and it's adaptable, and it changes. And it is kind of crazy to think that in this time, when there's so much awareness about racism, that there's still a major problem of anti-Semitism. It's not hard to understand if you understand that. I mean, really, what is anti-Semitism? I would define it as, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about definitions in today's world, but I think you could simply describe it as a movement that has inbuilt in it a belief that there is a Jewish power out there that is controlling or manipulating things. So to imagine a world that's very conscious of racism, how would anti-Semitism express itself in that world? And let's look at what they say about Israel. What's the contemporary threat to Jews ideologically is that Zionism is a form of racism. So in this era of awareness of racism, the Jews have been linked in a way to the forces of reaction. And so it's not surprising at all that that would happen. And then, you know, for people like Corbyn and people that follow Corbyn, you know, there's a point where when you're talking about conspiracy theorists, there's some people that you'll never be able to convince, that you can't, it's not even worth arguing with, because conspiracy theorists have like inbuilt self-defense mechanisms. They're sealed off. So any perceived threat or challenge to their worldview becomes part of the conspiracy to control information. We heard this during Corbyn. You'd hear this line that the Jews are inventing charges of anti-Semitism to silence criticism of Israel. This is like, you hear this regularly now. And if you really look at what they're saying there, it's kind of deluded and deranged. They're alleging that Jews are working together to concoct accusations of anti-Semitism. And so you can't, that's very difficult to convince and for someone to see that. And I think the other part of this is people have trouble identifying anti-Semitism in people they otherwise agree with. So someone looks at Jeremy Corbyn maybe and says, oh, he's got all the right ideas, but he's got this weird obsession with Israel. This is similar to what happened with the Nazis in the 1930s. If you look at the main support system for the Nazis and Hitler, it was the old, like, nationalistic, militaristic, anti-communist, aristocratic way. The people that supported the old order, they looked at Hitler and they said, he's got all the right ideas, but he's got this weird obsession with Jews. We don't really get it. It's, you know, he riles up the masses with it. We'll ignore that. We'll take the rest. And they got it backwards, because in reality, with Hitler, the anti-Semitism wasn't on the periphery, it was central. It was everything else that was on the periphery. And when you look at people like Corbyn and the Squad, I think a lot of people find their ideas appealing. And I also think a lot of people recognize they have this obsession with Israel that doesn't make sense. And so it's scary to think that what's really happening here is the other stuff isn't the main stuff. It's the anti-Zionism. We may come, as we progress, we may find out the anti-Zionism is central, not all the other stuff. And so it's hard in that way for people to recognize it in that way. And the other thing is people just don't understand anti-Semitism. It doesn't start with hatred of Jewish individuals. It starts with, again, a warped perception or faith in the existence of a delusional Jewish power nexus. So one of the things you read or you hear people say or have said is, they claim they don't hate Jews. They just hate the powerful Jews that control everything in the world. Okay, well, when things go bad in a society, when things melt down very quickly, the invisible Jews that control everything becomes your Jewish neighbor who's never done anything. And so that's how it functions, and it's complicated.
Well, it's a lot of self-confirming biases too, because it's these imaginary Jews that we don't know who they are. But then when you do see one powerful Jew in power, they go, see, this is one of them, and it feeds itself.
It feeds itself and it builds. And we're going to talk about that, the self-destructive nature. It's almost like an acceleration of once a worldview is captured by that delusion, it takes over everything, and it just compiles, and the hidden hand is everywhere.
And it distracts from the actual problem that's going on, because you're busy running around chasing this mythical Jew, and you're not solving, as I think it was Cori Bush, you're not solving the infrastructure problem, and you're not solving the homelessness or whatever it is, because you're saying it's the Jews who are at fault. So
yeah, it's a deflection. It's anti-Semitism. There's a distinction between opportunistic anti-Semitism and then the true believers. It's hard to distinguish them, but they both function in the same ways in a lot of ways. But, there's people that want power could make the devil out of the Jews and distract from what the real problems are because it's easier. And that's what conspiracy thinking is.
So that's actually a great lead into our next question, which is, in the film, you talk about how powerlessness feeds conspiracy-minded thinking. So can you expand on that? Why is that the case?
Yeah, so we interviewed a few social psychologists. Dr. Phillips, who's down here in Florida, is in the beginning of the movie. And we studied a lot of the psychology and the research people were doing on conspiracy thinking. And most people that study it agree that conspiracy thinking is really a mechanism for people to make sense of the world for which they can't understand. So we do this naturally. We do threat assessment. We naturally connect dots that aren't there. We derive conclusions without all the information. We evolved in this way. And so when there's a sense of powerlessness, that's associated with fear. Fearful people desire security, and security comes with the knowledge of what's happening around you. So in reality, much of what happens in the world is really impossible to attribute to one single source. And and that's not very comfortable. It's hard to admit that, things are complicated and nuanced. It's easier to come up with a narrative and to come up with an enemy. In a strange way, people feel safer if we convince ourselves there's a plan to everything that happens. And that's true even if the plan is evil. Even if you think there is a cabal of evil people controlling the world, that's still more comforting than the truth, which is there's nobody controlling the world. There's no plan. All of it's random, and we don't know what's going to happen. And so, yeah, it's a self-defense mechanism. It's a cope in a way.
So having established that point, then why are the Jews the target? We've seen this in the documentary. You showed how, during the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, this pattern keeps emerging of the Jews being blamed for all of the world's ills. Why are the Jews the target?
That's a great question.
That's a tough question.
I mean, that's the question everyone wants the answer to. It's not clear why the Jews. I mean, one gentleman we interviewed for the second movie, a guy named David Patterson from the University of Texas. He's a really cool guy, but he told us he believed that the hatred of the Jews can be traced back to ideas in the Old Testament of there being no earthly redemption. That to the non-Jewish world, Jews represent the rejection of salvation. And therefore the enemy or scapegoat of, they're the natural enemy of any revolutionary global movement, any right or left, any desire to create a new world. The Jew represents a hindrance to that. And that was his position. That's not a new idea, but it's interesting to think about. David Hirsch out of the UK, great author. If you haven't read his work, he's amazing. But he makes the point often that anti-Semitism has nothing to do with real Jewish people. Anti-Semites create their own conception of Jews and then they kind of build around it. So it's all based on a false notion of what Jews are. And so I think that tells you that it has nothing to do with actual Jewish people, but Jews as a collective have been positioned as this scapegoat for demagogues. And I mean, what do you attribute to that? Why is that? There's probably an endless amount of historical reasons that are deep, like what David Patterson said, and then there's probably a lot of just practical realities. The sheer truth is that there's centuries of anti-Semitic literature. So if you start dipping into that world, you're gonna come across it. And so it's just built on top of each other, built on top of itself for so long that maybe it's just the Jews were positioned this way and it's hard to break out of that. Who knows? But it's interesting to think about, what if there were no Jews in Europe? What if 1,000 years ago, the Jews went to Israel or they were somewhere else and they couldn't be persecuted in Europe? Would there be another group that filled that position? Who knows? A lot of the people that were anti-Semitic in the 19th century were also very anti-Masonic. The Masons also took this kind of, bloated, there's a lot of fear and paranoia about Masons. Maybe it would have been Freemasons if they're, who knows? But for whatever reason, the Jews have been positioned in this role as scapegoat, and it's not Freemasons, it's us. It's going to be our kids, it's going to be our grandchildren, and
it has to be addressed.
Yeah. Who knows?
Which is part of what we're trying to do here. Really quick follow-up though, you said that there's centuries of literature that could explain potentially why the Jews. So why did you both in the documentary choose to go back to Burwell to discover the origin of the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory?
Well, because Burwell was, we started with him because he sort of represents the beginning of the shift in anti-Semitism from religious to secular. Burwell was a religious person, and it's not him, but Burwell starts kind of that change. The French Revolution really does it. And by the 1870s, anti-Semitism is now part of new ideas of, nationalism and racial science, and the religion is kind of taken out of it. So Burwell in the French Revolution is kind of the beginning again of this notion that Jews are conspiring within societies. They're taking over institutions and using that to a cause. Before that, Jews were isolated. They were, there were similar patterns, there was overlaps, they were politically scapegoated for things that existed. But Burwell in the French Revolution was a major shift in the history of anti-Semitism and how we understand it. And so yeah, that was just an appropriate starting point to explore it.
So you kind of alluded to this in your answer now, but I was gonna ask next what you think the main differences are between the anti-Semitism we saw in medieval times and the Enlightenment. What would be the main changes that we saw over those time periods?
Well, at the time of the revolution, it's really what caused it was the changing circumstances and the political winds were changing. But at the time of the French Revolution, there was growing paranoia over secret societies like the Freemasons, the Bavarian Illuminati. There were stories about other secret groups who were thought to be exploring revolutionary ideas that were viewed as a threat by the monarchs and the church power. So there was a lot of fear of secret societies. With that, one of the results of the revolution was the emancipation of Jews from the previously French Catholic state. This was the first major European power to grant Jews civil rights. So from people that opposed the revolution, they looked at this and they viewed Jews as beneficiaries of the revolution in a sense. So they viewed those ideas that there was a confluence of forces and factors that came together. You have the major shift. The French Revolution was monumental in history. It changed the course of Western civilization. You have paranoia over secret societies, and you have Jews entering society for the first time as citizens. All of this creates space for the people that were opposed to the revolution, supporters of the ancient regime, to explain what had happened through conspiracy theories, because they probably didn't have any other way to understand the magnitude of the event, to make sense of it. And so a lot was happening then. And again, this is the beginning. Jews are now entering society, and society shifting drastically. And the anti-Semitism, it was thought at the time that secular society would naturally reject anti-Semitism.
Because it was religious based at the time.
Because it was religious based. And, that goes into that, there's so much about it that we don't really understand. All we can do is look at the history and try and kind of track and see how it happened. But it went from religious based to this idea of international conspiracy.
It evolves to fit the current situation always. I mean, if it's not religious, it's not secular, we'll find another way to appear. Which
doesn't make sense. And to be honest, I mean, the Enlightenment figures, they supported, I shouldn't say that, but yeah, there was a sense that it wouldn't make sense for a secular world to remain anti-Semitic. And Herzl, in a way, makes a similar mistake. He believed that a Jewish state would end anti-Semitism. He writes this in Judenstaat. He was wrong about that. We know that now, that a Jewish state did not end anti-Semitism. So there's that famous, I think it was Rabbi Sachs from the UK, who made that video talking about how they used to hate us for our religion, and then they hated us for the race, and now they hate us for our state. So it seems like that's what you're saying.
Yeah. It evolves to fit. It evolves as we evolve. Okay, so let's move on to the next question. I have a point that I want to talk about in relation to that, because you're saying it wouldn't make sense in a secular world for people to still be anti-Semitic. But then something else that we saw is anti-Semitism was rising and spreading during these periods of social progression, as democracy is spreading, liberal values are spreading, these values that they seem antithetical to this form of hatred. And so do you find it at all surprising that all these values that we hold dear in a democratic liberal society, such as love of truth and tolerance towards minorities and, due process, justice, that didn't stop anti-Semitism from proliferating?
No, it didn't. Anti-Semitism found its adherents, its demagogues in the modern day. And it goes back to what I alluded to earlier, which is, anti-Semitism functions, it's for political movements. The enemy of my worldview, the antithesis to my beliefs, is linked to the Jews. So it's only natural. It is surprising, but it's not surprising in a way, that in that world where everyone is very aware of racism, that somehow the Jews are implicated in that, and in which they are now. Again, back to Zionism as racism. That's how you could if it's happening, but that's how you could fathom a situation where an advanced society aware of racism and concerned about it could deal with like an adapted anti-Semitism. Yeah, it's still here. So it is very surprising, and it's not surprising at all. And that's where we're at now, you know.
Somehow that makes perfect sense to me. Okay, so my next question is going back to Burwell and this Simonini letter. I don't know how to pronounce that, but this letter Simonini. You gotta do it with the hand. The Simonini letter that kind of brought all the different elements together to inspire his belief in the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. I saw parallels between that and then later on when we have the Protocols of the Elders of Zion during the Russian Revolution. So do you also see the same parallels, and can you expand on that? If so,
it's interesting that the Simonini letter and the Protocols
were both hoaxes.
Yeah, I mean,
both made up.
I had that I wanted to share it. I can't find it. Okay, never mind. Forget it. All right. So the Protocols and the Simonini letter, they're interesting in that they're both hoaxes. They're not real, and they're both born out of fear of liberalism and preserving the old order, right? So these hoaxes were designed to take all of the various forces that threatened the position of high society and pin it on a Jewish conspiracy. Both of those do that. And I guess, I mean, you could look at it, they either really believed it or, again, opportunistic anti-Semitism. Maybe they were hoping that if they could convince the population that liberalism isn't what it appears to be, it's actually a Jewish plot to enslave you, that people would reject it. I guess that was the thinking. It's very, you know, not very imaginative. Anyway, so I think what's interesting about that is to think about it in the opposite direction. Now, imagine a situation where people that want the new order, that want to overthrow the old order, imagine they pinned the old order to Jews. It could work in the opposite way. And this is something we're definitely seeing now. We just saw it in a recent election in Ohio with Nina Turner. The rhetoric from people like Mark Pocan, like Nina Turner, like a lot of the people she campaigns with, was that DMFI, there's this Jewish conspiracy that's coming from out of state to undermine this election. And they were also connecting this with, these are the forces that are opposed to our revolution. They want to protect their wealth. And so they're trying to undermine us. So you can see how in both ways, whether it's revolutionary or whether it's reactionary, people could simplify a lot of the problems and a lot of the issues by just, blaming it on Jews. And it works in both ways.
I think even the same person can think both things. That's the incredible thing about anti-Semitism as a conspiracy theory, is they contain multitudes. Like, they can believe so many contradictory things at the same time. Jews are inferior. Jews are controlling the whole world with their tentacles. It doesn't have to make sense. It just explains their problems in a way that is convenient to them. Exactly. And it could be an answer for everything. Well, again, there's a point where it always goes back to the conspiracy. And like you said, it could be contradictory. It doesn't have to make sense at all. It could be the Jews are the communists or the capitalists. They're controlling the Soviets and the Americans. They're doing this and they're doing that. They're inferior, yet they're superior. It doesn't have to make sense.
Well, it's because they're never talking about a real person or a real thing. It's always an imaginary, it's them. It's who, when you start digging into who is them, they never actually know. Because if they pick one person or one group, whether it's the Hasidic Jews or the ultra-liberal Jews that they exist to, they'll always find a way to make it fit into the narrative for what it is they need to explain away at that given moment. Yeah. And it's interesting you bring up they, because you always bring that up to me. And we've seen that so much recently on social media. When you see someone use the word they and they don't clarify who the they is. Yeah. It has some implications there. And typically it sounds like they're referring to the Jews.
In the world of conspiracy, like we were saying earlier, because of how long Jews have been scapegoated, there's already an extensive literature from anti-Semites going back to the 16th century, once you dip into that world of conspiracy and thinking, oh, there's an alternative reality happening, it's not uncommon people end up with, the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. It's always there in that world, at least. So the world of conspiracy thinking online, if anyone's ever brave enough to jump into it, there's anti-Semitism everywhere.
But don't do it.
Yeah, don't do it.
Don't go into the dark web.
Unless it's for educational purposes.
Even then.
Yeah, without getting too far off topic, Noam, there was a conspiracy theory leveled against you in the comments on this documentary.
It's actually posted on our Instagram, which is way less active than our Twitter, where my accent, the cadence of my voice that I used to narrate the movie was apparently what did they say? It was a very common method of cult leaders to hypnotize you and to make you believe and do whatever it is that I was saying, when really all you have to blame this on is Israeli accent and trying to keep it the words very clear, over enunciating, if you will.
Yeah, this person thought, Noam, it was like a psyop, that you were using some brainwashing technique to brainwash people, and who knows?
Which implies
maybe.
Yeah,
Does anyone feel brainwashed?
Yeah, it implies you were doing a good job. They felt
exactly. I really took it as a compliment. I have a screenshot of it saved. My persuasion knows no limits.
Okay, going back on track. Sorry, that little interlude. So in the documentary, you talk about Hitler being the culmination of a shift from religious to race-based anti-Semitism. Is this the phase that we're still in today?
Well, after the Holocaust, there was once it was revealed to the world what had happened there. I mean, people had to confront what this was, and that was the end of sort of that idea of racial. It was dismissed completely. It was not acceptable to believe this stuff anymore. So no, I think that was the end of that. And shortly after, there was kind of another shift. And that's what the next movie is going to be about. And we could say you described it as towards the state. The new shift was towards anti-Zionism. It was just changing the language of anti-Semitism and applying, and so that was kind of the end of that. It was called a culmination because the ideas that Hitler really believed in an international Jewish conspiracy, I mean, those ideas had been festering in Europe for decades, since the French Revolution, let's say, for over a century. And then someone went crazy, they took power and they acted on those ideas, and everybody, the whole world saw how evil and terrible it was. And so things, it shifted again after that. And that's where our second movie will start. We'll
God willing.
So it was kind of, the Holocaust was the end of that kind of the acceptability of racial anti-Semitism. And now we're dealing with something a little different. It's always the same, but it comes in different packages.
It didn't shut the door completely, though. It allowed some sense of an evolution or a mutation of it. I think that kind of leaked into our current society, because you could still see some.
Yeah, it still exists. It's just, the acceptability of it is what changed. I mean, the ideas are still there and people still believe them. It's just most decent society has said, this is freaking crazy.
Okay, so moving on to the next question. We kind of discussed this a little bit earlier, the idea of anti-Semitism as being self-destructive. And in the documentary, you discussed it in terms of Hitler going around and chasing this mythical enemy and devoting crucial resources to destroying the Jews, exterminating the Jews. Meanwhile, he was fighting another war with the Allies that actually posed a real existential threat. But that didn't matter to him because he was still going around chasing this mythical enemy. Do you think that that's still happening today in another way? And if so, what is this other war front that people are ignoring while they're going around chasing the mythical enemy?
Well, I mean, again, opportunistic anti-Semitism is really a deflection from reality, and it's blaming Jews for problems. And it's not, while you're blaming Jews for problems, as in, for example, Mark Pocan and Nina Turner in Ohio, you're ignoring what's really happening. So you can create a narrative where it's actually a Jewish plot to oppress us and to keep whatever order in place, or you could actually deal with the problems people are facing. So when you start a movement or when you pursue a line with anti-Semitic conspiracy thinking, there's no answer there. You're just going to keep turning over and keep self-destructing. You're not going to ever find it. It's just, you're just going to keep chasing it while everything else is being disregarded. And I mean, there's Hitler's the best example of self-destructive anti-Semitism. He was, as you said, he was murdering civilians that didn't do anything. He believed that this was how he was going to win the war, was by killing these children, innocent civilians. He believed, he was a true believer and believed the United States and the Soviet Union, the UK, were controlled by Jews, and this is what they did. And so that really shows you the self-destructive nature of believing in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and scapegoating Jews. There's no end to it. It just keeps going, it keeps doubling down, and it goes crazier and crazier and crazier. So it's absolutely self-destructive. And it's always important to point out that it's not just a threat to Jews. It's a threat to society. It creates a paranoid, destructive climate, and everyone suffers because of it.
And distracted as well. People are not focusing on all the other, the real issues that we could be addressing.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
So it's self-destructive and it destroys everyone else. It's just pure poison. It's really like, I always said that anti-Semitism is really the best expression of human irrationality. It's there's nothing that's more irrational and more embedded in human history than anti-Semitism, in my opinion.
Which you would think it would be easier to recognize if that was the case, but it's the hardest.
Yeah, and that's the crazy thing about today, is that we're having this argument that it's unbelievable. But going back to that notion that what we're hearing now, which is normalized in this society, is to accuse Jews of making up anti-Semitism to protect Israel. That is normal for people to say on television and mainstream news. This is crazy. I mean, based on the history and everything we've dealt with, and we like to, so many people are documenting what happened in the 20th century, what's happening with anti-Zionism. We have the data, we have the information, and yet we're still being gaslit and told we're conspiring to help Israel. And with all the history, the fact that we're still doing this, it's so exhausting and demoralizing.
And the thought of what would happen to Jews now if we didn't have Israel is...
Oh, yeah, of course.
You don't want to go there. I mean, it's terrifying. It's, what was the name of the lady from the education board in Arizona? Lupe.
Yes, that's California.
Oh,
it's
California.
Liberated Ethnic Studies in California.
I mean, it's a discussion of the educational board, and she's freely saying that right away, if there's any complaint about the
curriculum. I'll explain. Let me give the background. So we tweeted a video clip of Lupe Carrasco Cardona and Teresa Montano, two members of the Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum Coalition in California, who wrote an anti-Semitic curriculum, and now they're trying to push it in California. So we posted a clip of one of their discussions that took place last week. And in regards to concerns over the curriculum, she was just saying things like, there's going to be a tax on our educators from Zionists who...
And this is not paraphrasing.
We
will be attacked by Zionists. We have been, and we will continue to be. And we have to unite and be prepared.
And resist. So this goes into the conspiracy thinking. They're sealed into their worldview, and anything we say will be viewed as some sort of plot to undermine whatever they believe. And so when you watch those videos, they're on our Twitter. I think that one should be at the top. Mm-hmm. You're staring at somebody that you can't convince, somebody that is so committed to their worldview, and they will do anything to get it. You're staring. I mean, it's very disturbing. And this is for K through 12 education in California. This is not, everything they say is pretty standard at major public universities, which is another issue that, we don't really talk about universities, but they're crazy. But this is for kids. This is for fifth graders.
Yeah.
They're going to create an environment where, the Jewish kids won't be able to sit in the classroom. They're going to be depicted as oppressors, as racists.
The word Zionist became, and the way she was saying, is synonymous with saying a racist. It's synonymous with saying a Nazi. She was saying it as it's an insult. And, we don't have kids, but I'm thinking our household we're going to speak about Zionism. We're
proud Zionists.
We're very proud Zionists. And I don't think that comes at the expense of any other minority or any other human, mm-hmm. in the way that she was saying it.
Yeah, it's very disturbing.
Yeah, and it obviously, this organization is formed by two people who saw anti-Semitism rise in college campuses. I started to see the beginning of it when I was in college, and it's something that our community has talked about at length. But now we're seeing in California something coming from the top down, which is concerning. Up until now, it's been, from the bottom up, and it's been tolerated, which is not any better. But to think that it's going to be inserted into the curriculum for young children, and they're really not equipped to.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just go ahead. You made up a good point that this is coming from the top down. I didn't research it, but if that were to pass, if any school district were to adopt the liberated ethnic studies model curriculum, it would be an example of state-sponsored anti-Semitism in America in 2021, funded by the federal and state government to indoctrinate children. This is unthinkable. And
in California, where the Jewish population is very high.
Mm-hmm. We have family.
Yeah. Mm. Well, it's a lot of family.
That was, yeah.
Yeah.
There's a demand to hear you speak more, Noam. So is there anything else you want to say about this question, or I can move on to the next question?
Move on to the next one.
Okay, it's tied into this. I was going to ask about Holocaust education, because that's also such a hot topic. So my question is whether you think that it should focus on the type of Holocaust education we grew up with, the Nazi-esque anti-Jewish prejudice, or should it take the same approach that your documentary did, which is more research-based and, kind of puts things into perspective in a different way and talks about anti-Zionism as well?
It's a difficult question for me to answer because my childhood was so different from Joe's, for example. I had a more realistic example of it. Our great-grandmother still had a number on her arm. So it created a very, very real picture of what was actually happening there. I think that you have to also remember that we learn history in order to avoid repeating it, as we know. And there has to be a combination of both. It has to be research-based, of course, but you also have to know who it is that you're teaching it to. Because if you're teaching it to first graders, it has to be catered to them so that
I see what you're saying. I mean, maybe take them to Israel. Maybe that's a way to
it in a way that is appropriate for first graders. So take it to Israel, and then as you progress in age, you can learn more and more. Still make it, of course, I don't want to say child friendly, because it's such a difficult topic to address.
But I think in recent times, parents have had to address so many difficult topics with their kids, like racism, the pandemic. So I think what you're saying is spot on.
Mm-hmm. In the same way that we do with anything. And if it's a cautionary tale, it could be told like that.
I totally agree. Completely agree with that.
Well, I think it should be. It's hard for me to imagine how, I mean, you can't really understand what happened in the Holocaust without understanding the history and nature of anti-Semitism. Because, I mean, what we were describing earlier about how they were pursuing the war effort and how they viewed the world and what was happening, it's hard to imagine without at least, you know, looking at the history that we touched upon in the movie. You need to understand anti-Semitism for that to work. I took a Holocaust course when I was in high school. That was a semester long. It was a great course. We learned about what happened between 1941 and 1945. It seems like a lot of the push for Holocaust education initially was in response to the, you know, Holocaust denial. People really wanted to make sure that this was cemented and that people understood what happened and that the memory didn't fade and so people wouldn't forget. But to really understand what happened, what Hitler believed, and, you know, to make, you need to understand anti-Semitism. And that's one of the reasons why I so support, I don't think we should have any Holocaust education bills without the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. And there's a few reasons for that. One, it helps people understand contemporary anti-Semitism. This is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance guidelines. It helps people understand what's happening today, but at the same time, it helps people see how anti-Semitism could function in different contexts and how it's not, you know, the spokesperson for Ilhan Omar like tweeted out, just anti-Semitism is a right-wing phenomenon. That's all he wants to say, and ignore any notion that it could exist on the left. Well, that's not true. He doesn't know what he's talking about. So, I mean, there's another side to this in the current situation, Holocaust education could be, if you don't have those guidelines, if you don't have protections, and it could be abused by, you know, any number of, you know, political extremists that are teaching classes. Who knows? So that's why I support having IRA. You need IRA in Holocaust education bills.
It definitely has to have very, very clear guidelines because people like to get very loosey-goosey with certain things.
And we see in anti-Zionism, we see it all the time. Holocaust memory is always like challenged. People want to say, the mayor of London, I forgot his name now, but during the whole Corbyn catastrophe, he had said something about like the Zionist work with Hitler. There's always this effort to like make them to call Israelis Nazis. Imagine a Holocaust class where a radical person was teaching this. It would be, I mean, this is a horrifying thing to think about. So
Sadiq Khan.
No, it was the guy.
No, Livingstone.
Yeah,
Blake
Livingstone
commented that.
Oh.
Yeah.
So let's just address the elephant in the room. Do you think that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism? And if so, is it always anti-Semitism or just under certain circumstances?
I would say yes, absolutely. I think it's always. I mean, I'm sure that I think that there are certain situations in which criticism of Israel is legitimate, and I have criticisms of Israel here and there. But once it becomes, what's the motivation behind it is my question. First of all, are you trying to say, well, Israel shouldn't exist? Then, and that is a blanket statement that right away is anti-Semitic, especially in today's climate where Jews don't feel safe in other places of the world.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes is the answer. There are different motivations and inspirations for there's different anti-Zionisms, if you will. I bet it's best to understand them as right versus left. That's not a perfect classification, I understand, but for the purposes of today, it's a easy way to separate them. So if you look at the anti-Semitism that everybody kind of agrees on is wicked, the right wing, racist, nationalistic anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism, it's indistinguishable from the anti-Semitism. There's no moral scruples about it. White supremacist neo-Nazis they make no distinction. Every crazy thing they believe about Jews, every conspiracy theory could be just as easily applied to Israel and is applied to Israel. And nobody has any problem seeing that as anti-Semitic. So that's the right-wing variety. And then the left-wing anti-Zionism that we're also familiar with, to me, at this point in history, we can call it a definable movement that it just stands on its own. I think it started in the 20th century, and the base idea to modern left-wing anti-Zionism is this lie that Zionism is a form of racism. That's the starting point. You see, the right-wing anti-Zionists, they start with the Jews and they don't care, that they're open about it. The left-wing variety starts with that lie, that Zionism is a form of racism. And when you really dig into that, what is someone saying when they're saying that? They're saying that anyone that believes that Jews are a nation with a history and with an identity is inherently wicked, is inherently racist and evil. Once you have that established, we find that anti-Zionists of the leftist variety, they eventually work their way back towards the right. Because once you've established that it's just pure evil, you can start dabbling in all these, you start scapegoating this evil place for all the bad things that happen. So again, it's a 20th century phenomenon. It started in the Soviet Union. There's a lot of history there that we're going to explore in the second movie. And
and the left-wing Zionists, the left-wing anti-Zionists, they will coin you a good Jew or a bad Jew, depending on what it is you believe as far as Zionism, which in itself is racist. I mean, they're creating a divide within that group as well. If you're an anti-Zionist Jew, then you're a good one. Because you're a good one in that sense, and you create this mythical creature of the bad Jew.
Yeah, and then but on top of that, there's the accelerationist element to anti-Semitism, where eventually the anti-Zionist Jews won't be accepted anymore either. It compounds. Eventually, it will get to that point. Right now, it seems like if you're a Jew, all you have to do is deny your history, your identity, and you'll be accepted. But that's only for a short time. It gets worse, and it builds and it compounds. When we in this discussion, it's not uncommon that people go back to pre-Zion, before the state was established, and they look at certain people like Sir Edwin Montagu, who was in the British cabinet in 1917, who wrote a letter opposing Zionism. But if you look at what he wrote was problematic. What he wrote was, I am a British Jew, I live here, the Jews aren't a nation, and I think it's anti-Semitic to call it a nation. He had the wrong idea. So even then, you want to call that self-hating. I think, honestly, a lot of the anti-Zionism that came from Jews in the West before Israel, I think a lot of that was inspired by people not wanting to invoke an anti-Semitic backlash, to do loyalty charges. I think people like Sir Edwin Montagu felt compelled to come out. They felt comfortable where they were, in his case in the UK, and he just wanted to establish that and say, I want nothing to do with another country, I'm here. So, anti-Zionism fundamentally, it's about denying Jewish peoplehood. And so it's inherently anti-Semitic. And then once you get into the rhetoric, the conspiracy theories, anti-Zionism doesn't treat Israel or Zionism, because they make up their own conception of Zionism, but it's an international threat. When you say things like that, Rashida Tlaib's alluded to this. What does that mean? You're saying that Israel has international influence, but how? Oh, they have fifth columns in every country. They have, Zionist institutions. We hear this language now. During a lot of the May protests, you heard people railing against Zionist institutions in New York. What are they saying? They're saying Jewish institutions.
When people were driving around Jewish neighborhoods to protest what was happening in Israel.
Yeah. And
there are no Zionists.
Again, these are not new. This was definitely in the Soviet anti-Zionist program. You can Google it. There's an official, the Soviets had an official definition of Zionism, which is completely deranged. But you see how they started playing with that language and created something new. I forgot the definition, but it was very much like it's the international Jewish bourgeoisie that's opposed to communism and is doing whatever. So it was conspiratorial in nature. They made sure to do that in the 60s and 70s, and that has transitioned into the West now. And you see it. It's natural to anti-Zionists to talk about the media. Invading the United States, invading Iraq, this is Israel's fault. Well, how? Yeah. Does it Israel? It's either because you think Israel has magical powers, or you do believe in a conspiracy that Israel has a fifth column in every country. And I think that's what they're saying. And it's pure, that's exactly, that's everything in the movie, just rehashed in different language.
That's so funny you say that, because as I was watching the documentary, one of the things that struck me the most is, oh my gosh, we're hearing all the same stuff. We heard it in May. The idea of Jews trying to Judaize the world and being missionaries of evil, or just representing Jews as everything that society opposes. Of course, they don't say Jews, they say Zionists, but when you say Zionists equal racism, or Israel is apartheid, Israel is committing genocide, you're making it easier to get back to all the older anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that are outlined in the film.
It's just repackaged. It's the same narrative, just repackaged to make it more palatable for today's world, where you can't just say the Jews.
Yeah, exactly.
It all goes back, I think Zionism equals racism is a lot of it, that idea is what spurred a lot, all of it is kind of built on that notion. And it's terrible, it's evil. What could be said?
Taking a more bird's eye view of the problem, are you concerned about the rise of conspiracy-based thinking in general, whether or not it has to do with the Jews? For example, do you think QAnon is a huge threat?
Well, you know, any one of these movements is a potentially governing power, right? I mean, QAnon, it doesn't look like it has any power because it's all just a bunch of idiots that believe it. But what happens in 15 years? These ideas are floating around. Someone might do something with it that could enter the mainstream. So they're always, conspiracy theories should never be viewed as anything acceptable. They're based on irrational ideas. They are inherently dangerous. There's the flip side of the coin, though, where combating conspiracy thinking could be equally problematic, because as we said earlier, conspiracy thinking in a lot of ways is natural to human beings. We're emotional creatures. We're designed to be able to detect things without seeing them. We're not inherently rational. We're inherently emotional. We react to things in an emotional way. So anyone that wants to combat conspiracy thinking may have some crazy ideas as well. So you can't eradicate it. You can't get rid of conspiracy thinking. You have to create systems that prevent people that are crazy from using full power to oppress everyone. I guess that's really what you should do. So you have to be, conspiracy thinking is always concerning. Any movement that's based on a conspiracy theory is a concerning movement, but in combating it, we also do have to be careful and recognize that you're never going to eradicate it. You can't change the nature of people.
I think it was Professor Phillips that said this, and I don't think it actually made it into the movie, but he said, if you completely get rid of that, we're going to be a species of Spocks. We're all going to be Spocks. We're not going to have any ability to connect the dots further than it is very obvious to us. And we need that. We need to be able to do that to a certain extent.
Yeah, his point was the whole idea of us being inherent, like,
so sorry.
Yeah.
One moment.
What he was describing was conspiracy thinking is a natural human impulse, in that, as I said, I got this from Dr. Phillips, we're emotional creatures. He said if in a world where humans weren't emotional creatures, they were rational, we would be a world of Spocks, just, you know, basing every decision on pure data without any emotion, without any nuance or color, I guess, you know, or any spice. So that's the point he was trying to make. It's natural for people to do these things, to connect these dots, and while they're dangerous, it's equally dangerous for anyone to think that they can change human nature, and they can, you know, though that's another dangerous impulse. So we always have to be careful with these things.
Okay, so I see that Noam walked away for a second.
Yeah, she got an emergency call that she could not.
Okay, my last question was going to be directed towards both of you, so we can ask you first, and then when she comes back, we can ask her the same question. I was just going to ask, looking towards the future, you're going to be making part 2 of the documentary. You may have already started to think about what issues you want to cover, but what is the number one most important thing that to you that you're looking forward to covering in the second part?
Well, to me, I think that a lot of people see the rhetoric anti-Zionism, of anti-Zionists. And I know there's a lot of people out there that are concerned that not enough people are standing up or speaking out about it. But in my experience, when you show people what is said, they agree with you. They're not the loudest people out there, but people are generally good and rational. And if you show them what we're dealing with, they'll believe you. Show them the proof. And so that's what we want to do. We don't want to just show the crazy things that Rashida Tlaib says on Twitter. We want to show the history behind it, how we got here, what happened, and that's what we plan to do. The first movie is really this historical timeline. It tells the story of these ideas. It treats the conspiracy theory almost as a character, and we show the character and how it evolves through time. And the peripheral circumstances, a lot of times what happens in society impacts the ideas. We saw that in the first movie. And so we're just going to walk through it. We're going to start in 1946, and we're going to go to the present, and we're going to show everything that happened in the Cold War and how this new threat that we're facing developed. And I think in doing that, the notion, I think in doing that, people will understand why there's so much concern about this, among the Jewish community, and what this really is. It's not, we're having the national discussion, or the discussion about anti-Semitism. We're trying to share history and, dangerous rhetoric, and we're trying to prove it. And the response we always get is always criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. That's just the generic response. The goal with our movie, hopefully anyone that watches the second movie will say, okay, that's gone. This is not, we're not talking about criticism of a country anymore. You're obviously, in much of the rhetoric, there's no criticism, but that's always the goal. Hopefully everybody on the planet will watch it and will change the discussion.
Amen.
No, I told Joe I was going to ask both of you the same question. So looking towards the future and the second part of the documentary that hopefully you'll be making and releasing very soon, you have a different perspective from Joe. You're an Israeli Jew, and that's something that maybe you can talk to us a little bit more about. But what is the number one issue that you're more, or the most excited, to cover in the second part? And then kind of a sub part to that question is, do you think your friends back home are aware of the magnitude of this problem, the way that we see it here?
So I'm going to start with that part. I will say that my friends back home, every time that there is even the smallest event of anti-Semitism here in the US, they will contact me, and they are very concerned for our safety. And I think that goes, and it's funny for me to see that, because I'm so concerned for their safety all the time, especially what was last May when we were seeing the rockets raining down on Tel Aviv in a way that I've never seen before. And they're concerned about us. Like, to me, that says so much about what Israel represents for the Jewish people, and how they, no matter what, feel safer where they are with those circumstances than what they perceive us to be here in the US. And I can't fully disagree with them either.
That's a sad state of affairs.
Yeah. And the first part of the question, I've always been very excited and happy to talk about the birth of Israel in general. And I think it is so much a story about how from that situation, from the Holocaust, from years and years and years of persecution, we came back to our homeland, and we, like we say in Israel, we bloomed the desert, we made it blossom. And I love that. I love the whole concept of it. And I know it doesn't necessarily go into the issues, but it's a little triumph that we had. And I will always enjoy telling that story and what it represents. It's a modern day Hanukkah story.
That's a great, I think, note to end on, at least in terms of my questions. And then now I want to see if there's anyone who's attending who has any questions for Noam and Joe. Please feel free to put them in the chat, or if your video is on and you can talk. I don't know if that's an option. But if anyone has any questions, we would love to hear them. And
wait. Question.
Here we go. Do you guys see the question, or do you need me to read it?
Can you open it?
I can read it to you. So Blake asks, do we see the Democratic Party? Oh, excuse me, it disappeared. One moment to chat. Do we see the Democratic Party turning into the Labor Party?
Yes.
Yeah, this kind of already happening to a degree.
Yeah, unfortunately, in many ways, it's way worse. I talked to, because I was very much invested in the Corbyn situation, and I made a lot of friends in the UK that were dealing with that. And they would tell me the things that were coming, the rhetoric coming from the squad was far worse than anything that would be deemed acceptable in the UK. And so, yeah, and the worst part about this is that the leadership is not doing anything about it. They're not making any effort to try and curb this. And what's going to happen? The Democratic Party is going to be destroyed. Now, that may sound crazy, but what do we know about anti-Semitism? It compounds, it gets worse. You can't ignore it. And that's what they're doing. And I think they're going to find it's going to explode in their faces at a certain point. Their perception. And I talked to, all of my, the Jews in the Democratic, their long voting record of Jews for the Democratic Party. And a lot, when you have discussions with your Jewish relatives, I talked to my uncle recently, big Democratic guy. His attitude is, these Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, AOC, kind of this new radical, the squad. Yeah, they're crazy. They're dangerous, but they're not in control of the party, and the right wing is far more dangerous. So we'll deal with them, and they'll fade out. I wouldn't be so optimistic about that. And so I understand anyone that makes that connection between the Labor Party and the Democratic Party is absolutely right. And yes, it is happening. And as much as people like Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden want to make pretend it's not happening, it is happening. And again, it's not going to go away. It's going to get worse.
In a very dangerous direction. And then the.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah.
Oh, were you gonna say something else, Nam?
I was gonna say ignoring it, the waving it away and saying that it's wishful thinking, but I think it's even more dangerous than just full on addressing it. I mean, I'm a registered Democrat. I believe in a lot of the things in the party, but it's the last 5-6 years have made me feel very much not welcomed in the Democratic Party.
And we've seen the escalation in rhetoric already, just since 2018 or whatever it was. Rashida Tlaib's rhetoric, and we saw violence in May that we've never seen before. This stuff's just going to get worse. It's not just going to go away. And so yes.
Yeah.
Is there sort of a happy note to that question, or to your answer rather? Is there a way that we can combat it? How can we get ahead of the problem?
I think what we're doing today is a part of it. I think that having these discussions, these sometimes difficult discussions, and touching on these difficult topics is very important. And one of the only ways really to combat it is to raise awareness, and which it sounds like such a buzzword, like raise awareness, but we have to know what it is we're combating, the history of it, and how it went in the past in order for us to know how to handle it now.
Yeah, people are generally good, rational people, and if you show them what's happening, they'll listen to you. And I think that's a lot of the problems that we have now is confusion about anti-Semitism. What is it? So we just have to keep getting the information out, get the history out. We have to monitor what's happening and show how these ideas impact Jewish Americans in today's world. And we have to be resilient, and we have to have hope. And I think the best thing that's happening is what all of you are doing, what Isaac's doing, what Yuval's doing. Just get on Twitter, post your videos, put out your articles. People do see them. It does make a difference. And it's not easy, but it's not as gloomy, I think, as some people think it is. We didn't lose this struggle. It's not over. We can make our points, and that's what we have to do.
That's very, very true. Are there any other questions from anyone attending?
Do you see, there's a question from Jonathan Meldrum. I can't read it, my eyes are.
One sec, I do not see that.
There's a Q&A tab at the bottom.
One moment. Let me see if I can find that. Oh, I see that, okay. Oh, here we go. That answers a lot, okay. So Jonathan asks, how do you rate the chances of people in the West realizing that anti-Zionism is seeking the end of any Jewish state?
Well,
excuse me, sorry, there was more to that. Any Jewish state within any borders within the Middle East, because he thinks a lot of people don't realize.
I mean, if they don't realize it, it's because they're not listening, but it's they're pretty open and adamant about it. Again, going back to Zionism as a form of racism, that Israel is inherently a wicked place. Rashida Tlaib says this openly. You hear this openly from on universities. It's pretty clear that it's called a one-state solution. A very pleasant way of putting it. But no, yeah, this is discussed openly now. This is normal in our society. We openly talk about, or other people do, saying that there shouldn't be an Israel. In Ireland, Sinn Féin, their official Twitter account, one of the political parties in Ireland, just tweeted the other day, replace Israel with Palestine again, or something like that. So this is here. We're dealing with this. Yeah. Okay. A lot of people don't realize that. Yeah, that's true, because he added a lot of people don't realize. I think a lot of people that go to work every day that are not invested in these political issues. I agree. I don't think a lot of people realize that, and that's our job to get it out there. I think a lot of people are still on the whole, yeah, they're a little kooky, and they're a little obsessed with Israel, but they're harmless. There's no big deal. They don't appreciate what is really being said in this rhetoric. So you're right. We have to keep making our voices heard and keep discussing it. And yeah.
Jonathan also, oh, I'm so sorry. No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say my favorite thing is online on Twitter, when you get into these arguments, people will tell you to go back where you came from. And it's okay. So you want to go back to Israel. And I don't think they do fully realize what they're saying.
Yeah. I mean, that's something I've had to come to terms with myself, is they actually do not think that there's any Jewish link at all to the land. I think Muhammad al-Kurd says this a lot of the time. Like, there's no historical evidence, no archaeological evidence of a link. Yeah. That's hard to combat. How you're not even speaking the same language at that point.
You're not talking to a rational person at that point.
You've escaped the rational world, and you're now in an alternate reality with its own history. One of the, I tweeted, retweeted one of the, a shot from one of the PowerPoints from LESMC, the Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum, and they just erased Israel from the map. There's no Israel there. They don't think there's any connection between Jews and Israel. They believe that Zionism was some white supremacist imperial British thing. There's no connection to reality or history in what's being promoted right now. It's very unnerving. Like, as I'm talking, I'm like, God damn, that's really terrible.
So the next question we have is from Anonymous, and they ask, for the documentary, how did you find the interviewees? And when you pitched the film idea, what was their reaction? And they said, thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank you very much. And I think we started out by thinking what kind of topics we would like to cover. You know, the social psychologist, for example, we wanted to really get into the root of what is a conspiracy. How does it happen? And historically, we just found the experts that were, that were near us, really. Geographically.
Yeah, well, there's a perception that the way we got the interviews was just by reaching out and asking very qualified people in their respective fields to do a discussion. We were open about what it was. We did get rejected by a few people who hated, there's one guy in like California who sent me a nasty email about I refuse to take part in anything that would suggest that pro-Palestinian solidarity is anti-Semitic. How dare you? Or something like that, virtue suit. So there's a few of that. There's a funny story. One of the, we shot the first interview for the second movie with David Hirsch in New York. And when we were shooting it, one of the people on the crew, the gaffer, was sitting in the back. He didn't know, he was just part of the crew. He didn't know what he was shooting. And he was just sitting back there and he had this like terrible expression on his face. And I thought he was just bored with the material. But after the shoot, I asked him, what's going on? And he said he was a huge Corbyn fan. He had been very political and he knew about Corbyn. And so when we first started shooting the first one, things have rapidly accelerated since 2016 when we started. I think now it would be a little more difficult to try and get interviews about this type of stuff. And there's a perception that universities are kind of crazy hotbeds of anti-Semitism, but it's not every department, obviously. So if you message someone in a history department, he has nothing to do with the crazy stuff happening at the student union. And so, yeah, we just people that were open to it and people that agreed with it, thought we were doing a good thing. And we're happy to share information. I think it would be harder now, though.
And have you started thinking about who you're gonna approach for the next part, or is it's gonna be again who is responsive and who believes in the project?
Well, we have a few people that already agreed to be. Now, all of it was pre-COVID, so it's all been kind of on hold since then. And soon, hopefully, again, God willing, we can kind of resume that, but we will again think about the points that we want to really touch on and find experts who are willing to participate.
Yeah, and the academics, we have almost all of the interviewees selected already, and it's all based on stuff they've done, and obviously, but since the focus is anti-Zionism, many of these people for the second one are already kind of well versed in this, and they see what's happening and they kind of agree that this needs to be said. So just as an example, if we're looking at the 68 Polish crisis where Jews were expelled from the country in an anti-Zionist purge, we have someone that'll discuss that, and then you just go from area to area, and it's a diverse collection of interviewees.
And we're lucky to be in a pretty university heavy area where we went to UM, we went to FAU, we drove to UCF.
For reference, we're in South Florida.
Yes.
And we used Skype for the first movie. We were kind of we were ahead of our time, because that's
Skype,
like
Zoom.
This is pre-COVID. We were shooting Zoom interviews.
Yeah, which was a challenge, but it was. I mean, yeah, we didn't even let that stop us.
Yeah, no, we figured it out. We made it work.
You got ahead of the curve, because now that's the model.
We thought it was going to be awkward for, how do you shoot someone interviewing someone on a computer? At that time, that was a crazy idea. Now it's just kind of whatever.
That's what you do. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Okay, so are there any other audience questions before we wrap up? Anyone want to say anything, comments, concerns?
Oh, well, Jonathan added another question. He said if people realized what the goal of anti-Zionism if it was to destroy Israel, would people become much more suspicious of it? And absolutely, yeah. If people found, I think so. Most people support the existence of Israel. They support Jews living safely in their own country. And that's why I think you find that a lot of people don't say that openly. I don't think you'll ever get, Rashida Tlaib has alluded to the fact that she supports BDS. She supports a one-state solution. She'll never put it as we have to destroy the Jewish state. She may in the future, if things get worse and there's more people accepting the lies about Zionism, maybe she'll be able to at some point to come out and be aggressively saying, I want to destroy Israel. But hopefully we won't get there. All of us are going to stop it before that happens.
Okay, well, Thank you both so much for your time. Thank you everyone for attending tonight. Just a reminder to follow New Zionist Congress on Instagram and Twitter. Come to our Wednesday discussions and to all our events, and keep an eye out for the next part of the Conspiracy Libel documentary. And that's it. Thank you so much. Laila Tov, everyone.
Laila Tov, thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Bye.